I knew something was off the second I turned onto my street. My RV wasn't where I left it. I'd taken a last-minute job cancellation as a blessing came home early, thinking I'd surprise my daughter with a backyard movie night in the RV. Instead, I found an empty patch of gravel next to my garage and fresh tire tracks leading straight out of my driveway. My name's Benton Varelli. I'm a contractor, single dad, and I've lived in this neighborhood for 6 years. Long enough to know that the HOA here isn't just strict, they're power-hungry tyrants with too much time and not enough common sense. And their president, Harriet Penmore, is the queen of them all. Harriet was the type of woman who wore pearls to weed her front lawn. Blonde bob, pressed khakis, and a voice that could cut glass. Always had a clipboard, always had a complaint, especially about my RV. It's an eyesore, she said last month during an HOA meeting, standing in front of everyone like she was addressing Congress. It violates Article 12, Section 3 of the Community Preservation Code. I had already shown her the exemption for recreational vehicles parked on a resident's property less than 72 hours. She didn't care. Harriet made her own rules. I pulled into my driveway, heart pounding, and whipped out my phone to check the footage from the security camera I'd installed above the garage last summer. And there it was, Harriet herself, at 10 that morning, unlocking the RV door with a key. My spare. I'd kept it in the lockbox by the hose spigot, and she must have seen me use it. She climbed in like it was hers. Behind her, 2 men I didn't recognize helped load duffel bags and a cooler. They weren't neighbors. One of them even sat in the driver's seat. "You've got to be kidding me," I muttered, rage bubbling up. I jumped in my truck and headed straight for the main road. There's only one way out of our neighborhood that you can take a vehicle that size. I caught up with them at the gas station on Route 53, 2 miles out. The RV was parked by a pump, and Harriet was standing outside talking on her phone like she owned the world. I rolled down my window. "Harriet," she turned, startled, then immediately put on that fake calm smile she always wore at HOA meetings. "Benton, what a surprise." "Just taking care of a little community business," she said, tucking her phone away. "By stealing my RV?" "I wouldn't call it stealing," she said, stepping toward me. "The board voted to impound it. It was in violation again. I warned you." "There was no vote." "And you don't have authority to seize private property." "Actually, we do. Section 16, you broke into my property, Harriet. That's theft." She didn't like the word. You could see it twitch in her left eye. One of the guys inside peeked out the window. "You're making a scene," she snapped. "Oh, you haven't seen a scene yet." That's when she pulled out her phone again and dialed. "I'm calling the police. You're harassing me." I stepped out of the truck, arms crossed. "Go ahead. Let's see what they think about your little field trip." She actually did it. Stood there, dialing 911 right in front of me, whining about a disgruntled resident threatening her at a gas station. I just leaned against my bumper, waiting. I knew exactly how this was going to play out, and this time I had all the evidence. 2 sheriff's cruisers rolled into the gas station 10 minutes after Harriet's call, lights flashing but sirens off. The deputies stepped out with quiet authority, one heading toward Harriet, the other toward me. The taller one, Deputy Morgan, approached me first. He looked to be in his early 40s, with a sun-weathered face and a habit of adjusting his belt every few seconds. His partner, a younger woman named Ruiz, began taking Harriet's statement near the convenience store entrance. "Afternoon," he said. "Mind explaining what's going on here?" "Sure," I said, handing him my phone. "This video shows that woman using a key to enter my personal vehicle without permission. She then had 2 unknown individuals drive it off my property." "That's theft." He hit play and watched the footage, his brow furrowing the further it went. He replayed the timestamp, then looked over at the RV. "She admit this. She's claiming it was community business." Morgan gave a dry exhale through his nose, the closest thing to a laugh I figured he allowed on duty, and walked over to his partner. Ruiz had her notepad out, but her raised eyebrow suggested Harriet's story wasn't selling well. "I'm the HOA president," Harriet was saying, one hand gripping her handbag like it was a weapon. The vehicle was left in violation of our regulations. I told him repeatedly. The board agreed it had to be removed. Ruiz didn't bother looking up from her notes. And the key? I knew where he kept it. He's careless. It was unsecured. That shouldn't count against me. Did you file a civil order to remove the vehicle? There wasn't time. We had a retreat scheduled. It was going to be a team-building weekend for the board. Ruiz finally looked up. You planned a trip using his RV? Harriet blinked. It was just sitting there. He never uses it for anything important. Morgan stepped in. Ma'am, you're admitting you entered his locked vehicle, used a key without his permission, and transported it without notifying law enforcement or obtaining a removal order. Harriet's mouth opened and closed. Then she folded her arms and said, I was acting in the best interest of the community. Morgan turned to me. Do you want to press charges? I want her arrested, I said flatly. And I want the 2 guys she hired identified. Ruiz radioed in a request for backup to detain Harriet and hold the RV until a detective arrived. Harriet's face flushed deep red, and she started pacing back and forth near the pumps. You have no idea who you're dealing with, she said, voice low but shaking. I've been president of that board for 11 years. And that ends today, I said. You're not above the law. The 2 men inside the RV were pulled out without incident. They turned out to be handymen Harriet had hired from another town, not residents, not licensed transport workers, just paid muscle. One of them had a warrant for unpaid fines in another county, so he was cuffed and taken in. The other was released after giving a statement. Detective Claire Hennings arrived an hour later. She wore plain clothes, jeans, blazer, and boots, and carried herself like she'd seen every version of this story before. She took my statement in full, reviewed the footage, and then asked me to walk her through the HOA's recent behavior. You said there's been escalating tension between you and the board, she asked, flipping through her notepad. They've been targeting me for months, petty citations, false complaints about noise. Last week they claimed my daughter's lemonade stand violated commercial sales restrictions. Hennings raised her eyebrows. You have that documented? Every notice, scanned and dated, good, keep it. This isn't just theft. If we can establish a pattern of harassment and abuse of power under color of authority, that's a criminal offense. As Harriet was finally placed in the back of a cruiser, she shouted something about legal overreach and ungrateful residents. No one paid her any mind. By the time I got the RV back to my driveway, it was nearly sunset. My daughter, Leela, was sitting on the porch with a bowl of popcorn balanced on her knees and our dog curled up at her feet. She looked up and grinned the second she saw me. Movie night still happening? I exhaled, tension finally starting to drain from my shoulders. Yeah, kiddo, it's definitely happening. Inside the RV, nothing had been damaged, but the back bunk had been made up with fresh linens that were definitely not mine. There was an open bottle of Merlot in the fridge and a clipboard on the counter listing the HOA leadership retreat agenda. It included things like vision alignment and enforcement strategies for non-compliance. I snapped a photo and tossed it in a box. The next morning, I took everything to my lawyer. Audrey NG had handled a zoning issue for me 2 years ago and didn't like bullies. She read through the HOA bylaws, shook her head and muttered, "She's going to regret that clipboard." By noon, Audrey had filed a civil suit demanding Harriet's immediate removal from the board, restitution for unauthorized use of property, and punitive damages for intentional infliction of emotional distress. But it didn't stop there. The sheriff's department issued a press release later that week. Harriet had been charged with motor vehicle theft, trespass, and unlawful use of a private vehicle. But what really rocked the neighborhood was what the investigation uncovered next. Turns out, Harriet had been using HOA funds dues collected from residents to finance personal purchases. A deep dive into the board's finances revealed spa treatments, catered luncheons, and even a weekend Airbnb stay last fall, all marked as leadership summits. Detective Hennings worked with the county auditor's office, and a full financial audit was ordered. 3 other board members resigned within days. The HOA was placed under emergency oversight by the city's Neighborhood Compliance Division, and a special meeting was scheduled to elect a temporary board. I didn't even have to campaign. Neighbors stopped me on the street, offering support, dropping off coffee, even helping clean up my yard while I dealt with the fallout. Leela's lemonade stand hit record sales that weekend, and someone left a handwritten note that read, "Thanks for standing up." Finally, someone pulled back the curtain. At the emergency meeting, I stood at the front of the school gymnasium, holding up Harriet's clipboard like a trophy. The crowd erupted in applause. "She treated our neighborhood like her personal kingdom," I said. "But this isn't a kingdom. It's a community, and it's time we started acting like one." The vote wasn't even close. I was elected interim president with over 90% of the vote, my first order of business. A motion to dissolve any policy that allowed board members to act without a recorded vote or resident notification. My second, closing the HOA's slush fund and calling for a public budget review every quarter. As for Harriet, she accepted a plea deal to avoid jail, but she was banned from holding any official position in a registered HOA for life. She moved out 3 weeks later, her house selling below market value after neighbors refused to mow her lawn out of protest. Leela and I still take trips in the RV. These days, it's parked proudly next to the garage under new neighborhood guidelines that I helped rewrite. And every time I see someone wave at me as I pull out for a weekend getaway, I remember the look on Harriet's face at that gas station the moment she realized the rules she weaponized were finally turning against her. 3 weeks after the fallout, the neighborhood still hadn't fully settled. The removal of Harriet was like pulling out a rusted nail necessary, but it left a hole. Everyone had questions, not just about what she'd done, but how she got away with it for so long. I didn't have all the answers, but I had something better, a paper trail. Audrey, my attorney, had been combing through the HOA's archived records with the help of a forensic accountant from the city. What they found wasn't just unethical, it was criminal. There were invoices for landscaping companies that didn't exist, payments to vendors who had never worked a day in our neighborhood, and thousands spent on legal consultations that had no receipts or billing logs attached. More disturbingly, there was a section in the expenditures labeled security compliance with quarterly cash withdrawals that added up to over $20,000 across 3 years. No explanation, no signatures. Just ATM receipts from a bank across town where Harriet had once worked part-time before her retirement. Audrey handed me a folder that morning with her lips pressed tight. "You're going to want to give this to Detective Hennings. And keep a copy somewhere nobody can touch." I didn't have to ask why. Later that afternoon, I met Hennings at the county administration building. We sat in a windowless room with a metal table and a buzzing overhead light that sounded like a fly trapped in a jar. She flipped through every page without saying a word, only pausing to underline figures with her pen and mutter the occasional curse under her breath. "Who else had access to this account?" she asked, tapping the final page. "Only Harriet, as far as I can tell. And one other name keeps showing up." I reached across and pointed. "Eldon Wexler, he was the treasurer, still on the board, resigned 2 days after her arrest, packed up and vanished," Hennings stood. "Then I need to find him." The next 48 hours moved fast. A subpoena was issued for the HOA's bank records. A search warrant followed for Harriet's personal residence, which led to the discovery of a storage unit she'd failed to disclose. Inside were stacks of homeowner complaint letters, many of them never filed. Several were marked with red ink. Target, followed by dates and citations she apparently intended to issue later, but that wasn't even the worst of it. Buried in the back of a locked filing cabinet were 32 physical checks made out to Eldon Wexler, each labeled as consulting fee or enforcement training. The total came to just under $40,000. None of it had ever been disclosed in HOA reports. "Looks like she was running her own little kingdom, all right," Henning said as we stood outside the unit, the sun setting behind us. "She was paying him to enforce bogus rules," I asked, more likely buying his silence. "These dates line up with when other board members resigned, but he stayed." "Probably because she kept him well fed." The city's district attorney filed formal charges 2 days later: embezzlement, conspiracy to commit fraud, obstruction of justice, and abuse of fiduciary duty. Harriet was already under probation from her plea deal, but this violated its terms. She was taken into custody again, this time without the courtesy of walking in herself. The news broke across local media like a dropped match in dry grass. Reporters parked outside our neighborhood for 3 straight days. A drone was even spotted hovering above Harriet's vacant house before the sheriff's department made them land it. The neighborhood Facebook page lit up with speculation, theories, and more than a few apologies from residents who'd once blindly supported her. But there was one thing that hadn't yet been resolved: the HOA's charter. The original bylaws dated back over 20 years and had been amended so many times that no one really knew what version was actually in force. That confusion was exactly how Harriet had operated, using obscure clauses, half-quoted rules, and procedural technicalities to silence dissent. So I called a town hall. We held it in the middle school gymnasium again, but this time we filled every seat. People brought lawn chairs, sat cross-legged in the aisles, or leaned against the walls. I stood at the front with Audrey to my left, and a projector screen behind us displaying in bold font, "Rebuilding Our HOA, a Community Charter." "This isn't about revenge," I began. "This is about making sure no one like her ever gets that kind of power again. We're rewriting this thing from the ground up, and you're all going to help." We broke into working groups: finance, compliance, dispute resolution, community events. Every group had at least 2 volunteers with legal or administrative experience. I floated between them, answering questions, clarifying timelines, and making sure no one tried to sneak in language that left loopholes. At one point, Mrs. Delaney, a retired postal worker who lived down the street, raised her hand during the compliance group's discussion. "Why don't we just make every citation require a photo and timestamp before it can be issued? That way it's not just someone's word." The room applauded. Someone else suggested rotating board elections every 18 months instead of 4 years to prevent stagnation. Another proposed a cap on emergency spending without resident approval. It was the most engaged I'd ever seen the neighborhood. By the end of the night, we had a draft outline of a new charter and a signed petition from over 70% of homeowners to dissolve the previous one. Audrey handed the paperwork to the county clerk the next morning, and the city approved the transition within 10 business days. But even with all that progress, there was one final thread left to pull: the identity of the anonymous complaints that Harriet had used to justify many of her fines. Hennings called me a week after the town hall. "We finally got a match on those complaint forms," she said. "They weren't anonymous, they were forged." She sent over scans. The handwriting was consistent across multiple forms, even when they were supposedly submitted by different residents. Worse, some of the names belonged to people who'd moved away years ago. Others had never lived here at all. She wrote them herself, looks that way, and the kicker: she used old rental applications from when she was HOA secretary. That's how she got real names. I brought the evidence to the next HOA meeting, now held in the community library. Eldon Wexler was still missing, but with Harriet back in jail and half the old board under investigation, the mood was practically celebratory. I passed the documents around. One by one, people realized their so-called neighbors hadn't complained about them at all. The noise violations, lawn citations, and parking warnings were all part of a fabricated campaign to keep residents too busy defending themselves to question her authority. "I can't believe I paid $400 for trimming my hedges too late," one man muttered, shaking his head. Another woman teared up. "She made me feel like a bad mom for letting my kids draw chalk on the sidewalk." "We're filing for restitution," Audrey said firmly. "Every unjust fine, every fraudulent citation. We'll get it back." By the end of that meeting, we passed 11 motions to reimburse affected homeowners, install a permanent financial oversight committee, and introduce a public grievance platform where residents could track every citation issued in real time. Spring rolled in, and so did change. You could feel it in the way people waved longer, lingered during dog walks, and showed up to weekend cleanup days with extra tools. The neighborhood was no longer a place where people whispered about the board behind closed doors. Now it was a place where you could knock on a door and ask for help and know you'd get it. I still drive the RV out now and then, but these days I make a point to invite neighbors to join. Last weekend, we parked it at the local park for a community movie night. Kids sprawled out on blankets, popcorn in hand, while the grown-ups chatted and caught up. And as the opening credits of the film rolled over the side of the RV, I caught one of the new board members, Marcus, a retired firefighter, leaning over to his wife. "Can you believe this all started because she tried to steal his camper?" His wife gave a short laugh, "and called the cops on herself in the process." I didn't say anything, just leaned back in my chair, eyes on the screen, and let the satisfaction settle in. Justice hadn't just been served. It had been rebuilt, line by line, by the very people she tried to control. The first official audit hearing took place in the county municipal building, room 2C, a beige conference space that smelled of old paper and lemon floor cleaner. The chairs were metal-framed and uncomfortable, but the mood in the room was anything but dull. Local press had set up along the side wall, notepads in hand, and every HOA member still in office was present, visibly nervous. Harriet, flanked by her lawyer, sat stone-faced across the room, her once pristine posture now wilted. Audrey and I had compiled a binder 3 inches thick, evidence of misappropriation, forged documents, and bank statements with red flags all over them. It wasn't just about what happened to my RV anymore. That had cracked the dam. Now, everything was pouring out. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s named Marjorie Talcott, flipped through the material with the kind of focus that made people shift in their seats. She didn't raise her voice once, but every sentence she spoke landed like a hammer. "Miss Penmore," she said, tapping a page, "you authorized 7 separate payments to a company called Sage Enforcements. Our records show that company does not exist in the state business registry, nor has it filed a tax return in 5 years. Do you have documentation to support these expenditures?" Harriet's lawyer leaned in to whisper something, but Talcott raised a hand. "No coaching. If Miss Penmore approved these as board president, she should be able to recall them without assistance." Harriet took a shallow breath and looked up. "They were subcontracted enforcers, independent compliance agents. Then you'll have no trouble producing their contracts, W-9s, or any service reports they filed. They didn't use formal reports, it was a verbal arrangement." Talcott didn't blink. "So you paid over $30,000 in resident dues to an unregistered vendor with no receipts, invoices, or written agreements." "I did what I believed was necessary to maintain order." The judge turned to the court clerk. "Mark that as an admission of fiscal negligence under HOA Statute 12.6. A murmur rippled through the room. Harriet's lawyer looked like he wanted to sink into the floor, but the most damning moment came when the forensic accountant we'd hired was called to testify. A soft-spoken man named Curtis Lang. He wore thick glasses and carried 3 manila folders. He opened the first, revealing a series of spreadsheets and highlighted entries. "Based on my analysis," he said, adjusting his collar, "Miss Penmore diverted funds from the community budget into personal accounts using a shell company registered under her cousin's name. That company, Wexler Consulting, received routine payments masked as operational expenses. At the mention of Wexler's name, Harriet's jaw tightened. She didn't speak. Lang continued, "In total, the diverted amount exceeds $72,000 over a span of 4 years. The judge leaned forward. "Is there evidence of personal benefit derived from these funds?" Lang opened the second folder. "Yes, Your Honor. These purchases include a home spa installation, multiple luxury hotel stays, and a leased vehicle registered in Miss Penmore's name. Additionally, security camera footage from a storage facility she rented shows her depositing HOA records and removing them in the early hours of the morning following her initial arrest. Are these actions documented with corresponding financial entries?" "They are." The room fell into silence. The judge folded her hands. "Miss Penmore, you are hereby referred to the District Attorney's Office for criminal prosecution on charges of embezzlement, fraud, and destruction of public records. Your bail will be reevaluated, and you are prohibited from contacting any current or former board members until the investigation concludes." Harriet didn't protest. She just stared ahead, unmoving. The gavel came down with a finality that echoed all the way back to the neighborhood. By the time I returned home that evening, the air had shifted. There was no more second-guessing from the neighbors, no more whispered hesitation. Julie from across the street brought over a plate of peach cobbler with a note that read, "Thanks for saving all of us." A few others stopped to offer help repainting the community signage, which still bore the old board's name. But there was a final task. I'd been putting off, one that didn't involve courtrooms or paperwork. It was time to clean out the RV completely. I opened the back door and stepped inside, the familiar scent of pine cleaner and fabric softener still lingering. The linens Harriet had laid out were still folded neatly, untouched since the day I brought the RV back. I boxed them up, along with the wine glasses she'd stashed under the sink and the ridiculous HOA Leadership Retreat banner I found rolled behind the bench seat. And then, tucked under the mattress in the back bunk, I found something I hadn't expected, a notebook. It was leather-bound with worn edges and a broken clasp. Inside were handwritten notes, lists of homeowners, and tallies that looked like a point system. Next to each name was a number between 1 and 5, with notes like fence color, uncut grass, loud weekend guests. At the bottom of the page there was a title, Compliance Priority Index. She'd ranked us. She actually had a scorecard for who to harass first. I sat there for a while, flipping through the pages. It wasn't just me. She'd targeted elderly couples, young families, veterans, single parents, anyone who didn't fit her image of neat and acceptable. She'd been playing chess while we thought we were just mowing our lawns. I brought the notebook to Hennings that night. She met me in the station parking lot, already in jeans and a windbreaker, off-duty but still sharp. "This is more than we expected," she said, flipping through the pages. She had a plan. "A real system?" Hennings nodded. "We'll add it to the case file. This strengthens the intent component, might bump the charges up. You think she'll actually see prison time? With this much, I'd bet on it." And she was right. 3 months later, Harriet was formally convicted on 7 counts of fraud and misuse of community funds. She was sentenced to 6 years in state prison, with eligibility for parole after 4. The notebook sealed it. The judge called it a written confession of systemic abuse. As for Eldon Wexler, he was picked up in Arizona and extradited. He cut a plea deal in exchange for testimony that confirmed Harriet's manipulation of the board and her use of bribery to maintain control. The HOA, now under the new charter and with a rotating leadership model, began to heal. We hosted our first community barbecue in early June, and over 100 people showed up. There was music, games, and a raffle to raise money for a new playground at the community park. I didn't make any speeches, didn't need to. The best part was watching neighbors actually talk to each other, no clipboards, no threats of citations, no silent judgment. Leela ran up to me with a sticky face and a snow cone in each hand. She handed me the blue one. "Can we do movie night again soon? Next weekend, I said, draping an arm around her shoulder. RV's ready. As we walked back home, I glanced over at Harriet's old house. The windows were dark now, the lawn overgrown. A foreclosure sign stood crooked in the yard, half covered in ivy. It would be auctioned off in a few weeks, and someone new would make it their home. Hopefully someone with better hobbies than ranking their neighbors. The RV rested in its usual spot, freshly washed, its tires chalked not because of HOA rules, but because I'd gotten into the habit. Not everything needed to be a fight. Some things were just routine, now quiet, easy, good, and that's the thing about justice. It doesn't always come loudly. Sometimes it rolls in on four wheels, parks exactly where it belongs, and stays, just like I did.